welcome. I have been dyeing my own tapestry yarn for about 18 years now. I learned to dye in 2005. So in a college class, actually in New Mexico. So it never occurred to me that I wouldn't dye my own yarn. Like that was just a thing that the weavers that I was working with all dyed their own yarn. And I was like, well, if you're a tapestry weaver, you dye your own yarn. So just an assumption, and realized later that that is not necessarily the way things go. There's some great yarns out there commercially produced, but I love dyeing my own yarn. I love being able to get whatever color I want. So that is a huge plus because commercial lines, some of them are fantastic. There's a couple that are really great for tapestry, but they, there's always a color that you want. So if you dye your own, you can get it. Okay, so this is where I am doing my dyeing. And today I have a couple things set up, and feel free to ask questions. I'll be showing you a setup for some jars you can see over my shoulder there, dyeing in jars. And then I have a couple pots set up. So these are the jars I'm gonna use. I already measured the dye out, and I have 5 tiny skeins of yarn I'm gonna put in here. And then all of these jars will go into one pot. So the next thing I need to do is add the yarn. And I have labeled the skeins so that they're in a bucket. The yarn has to be wetted out, which means it's soaked. I soak it overnight. But I've got the yarn here in a bucket. In these skeins are between 20 and 30 grams. This is number 1, and this jar is labeled, I don't know if you can see it, but labeled number 1. So we put that yarn in that jar, and then we need to add water till the jar is full. I want to keep that yarn from being all compacted. This is going to be a little sort of orangey color. And then I'm going to take a bigger pot. This is a 20 quart, I think. And I'm going to put those dye jars right in this quart, right in this pot. There will be a water bath at the bottom. And I'll heat them all at once, which is the fun thing about doing this. I'm going to add some water before I get more of the jars in there. That's my little timer. So that's just telling me, hey, check your pot over here. So this pot, I think you can see in the small view. And it is boiling at a simmer. I'm going to turn it down a little just to keep it at that temperature and add a lid. And then in 45 minutes, that will be done. I won't do anything else to that pot for 45 minutes. It just gets to sort of simmer. It's a great question, Sheila. Does the water dilute the dye mixture? Is it part of the dye mixture? The water's just a substrate. So I have lots of, we've talked about this a lot in the dye class, that the water is what the molecules are swimming in. It's sort of like, all those memes and stuff about fish. Fish live in the ocean. They don't know that they're in the ocean. Like it's just a medium that they're moving through, or maybe like we live in the air. The water's just a thing that the dye molecules are swimming in, and it's allowing the dye to connect to the fiber. The amount of water is only important in that you don't want too much water. It will dilute your acid, and it makes it too hard for the dye molecules to find the yarn. But the dye isn't diluted. It's just like the water is holding the dye molecules, and we're encouraging those dye molecules to find the yarn. Hope that makes sense. I'll show you how I measure out the dye for this one more pot, and that'll give you a little bit better feeling of, so I'm going to put dye in this pot. Right now it's empty. And we're going to put the dye for a color that is 80% turquoise and 20% yellow. I use a little dye book like this with all the formulas in it. And I'm going to add the dye to this jar and then put it in there. That's just a safety step. I could put the dye right in the pot, but I do this in case as I'm measuring, I screw it up. We're using yellow. This is one of my favorite colors. It's sun yellow. There's the third truck. And I use these little plastic cups to dye pour the colors in. So I use syringes, and you can get these at Proba Chemical and Dye. I need 33.27 milliliters of yellow. Having a little trouble with my syringe. I figured out the math ahead of time, and I need 33 milliliters of yellow. Oops. Of course, on camera, I'm going to spill that. So there's 20, and then I need 13. You just have to add the amounts depending on what your syringe will hold. The measuring part is important to me because I want to be able to remake a color. If I make something I really like, I want to know what I did so I can do it again. And if I don't keep track and measure carefully, then I won't be able to make it again. 0.27, this is a 1 ml syringe. I used to get these from my medical work, but these days all the medical syringes are fancy with special caps, so I just get them from the dye supplier. This is stock solution. I should have mentioned that. So this is 1% stock solution, and that's how you put the dye powders into a stock solution, and then you can measure from there. All right, so we've got our yellow, and then I need turquoise. I also always mark off, I don't know if you can see, I mark off when I've put the dye color in that jar. If I had many, many colors and I didn't mark off what I had done, I might put something in twice or skip something or whatever. So it's important to. So this is a 1% stock solution, 100 milliliters of water with 1 gram of dye. And then I measure it out in liquid form, which is safe and gives you a more accurate measurement also than if you were measuring the powder. So I made stock solutions last night, and now I can measure them out. I need 133 milliliters of turquoise. This is a sort of medium shade of green. It has turquoise and yellow in it. So let's see if I can. Do I have a 60 ml syringe? Oh, I do. Okay. This one's only 30, and I need a lot of this dye. So we'll go with the 60. So there's 60. Here's 120, and I need 13 more. Let's use this one for that. All right, and a tiny little extra bit. All right, so there's our, you can even see how green that is. It's really pretty. We're going to put that in the pot. So let's see, can you see? Yeah, you can sort of see that. Pour that in, let it sort of mix. To rinse out the right. And then stir it, and then we can add our yarn. The thing that is not in this pot yet is acid. I like to heat the pot up a little bit before I add the acid, but not too much. If you add the add the acid too late, it will hit fast. If the pot is too hot when you add the acid, it will hit really fast, and then you'll get really spotty yarn. You might want spotty yarn. Sometimes that's really nice. I had 2 skeins. In this pot. Right now I only have 2 burners set up on my stove, so this is just going to wait for a little bit until I have a spot on my stove to cook it. Barbara asked, what do you mean by level dye? So what I mean by leveling is I'm doing immersion dyeing, and I want the color to be even on the whole skein of yarn. I don't want it to be really dark in one spot and really light in another spot. A skein that isn't level, or a pot that isn't level, will create that where it's super dark in one spot and super light in another, or streaky. I want it all to be one even color. That's leveling. A level dye pot, level color, no streaks, as Mari said, or areas that are darker and lighter. Leveling salts, I use pickling salt now. I used to use glauber salt, which you can get from the dye studio, and I use sodium acetate and a couple other soap type of levelers, surfactants. Synthropol is one of the surfactants. So this is the pot that I started before we got going on this. Let me turn the camera around, and I think you'll be able to see better if I give you this camera. This pot I started a couple hours before this live, and it is a violet. Let's see what color's in here. This is a blue violet with black. There's quite a bit of black, so it's very dark. And let's see if you can see see how clear that is. It's not completely exhausted. It needs about 10 more minutes, and then it will cool until the pot is cool, so for quite a few hours. But it's kind of a miracle that it's nice and clear. That is what you want to see at this point. Okay, so I'm going to put this back on. Let that heat another 10 minutes or so, and then that will be ready to just sit in the pot and cool off until it's cool enough for me to pull the yarn out, and then it gets rinsed and hung up to dry. Okay, you guys have a great weekend, and yeah, awesome. This has been really fun. If you're interested in dyeing with acid wool dyes, the class is now open for registration again. It has actually got my beta class going, but you can jump into it. Same place, tapestryweaving.com. Look under online learning, dyeing with acid wool dyes. There's a lot more information there. And it's such a super fun class. I'll be doing more live Q&As and stuff just for the people in the class coming up in the next few weeks. So jump in if you really want to try doing this kind of dyeing that is replicable and works with formulas, and that you can make any color you want. It's really quite fun. All right, y'all. Thanks so much, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.